the whistler in the walls. When I moved to Stony Hollow, I thought I was leaving my past behind. A quiet, unassuming town tucked into the Appalachian foothills seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. The streets were clean, the people were polite, and the air was crisp and clean, everything I thought I needed. But within days, I began to notice things that didn't quite sit right. Stony Hollow was too quiet. Too clean. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, yet you couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had. I didn't know what it was yet, but it lingered, humming just beneath the surface like a low-frequency noise you couldn't quite hear. The first time I heard about the whistler, I was at the hardware store picking up paint for my new house. The cashier, a thin woman in her 60s with wiry hair and glasses, paused as she rang me up. "You're new here," she said. I nodded. "Just moved in last week. Fixing up the old Miller place on Crestview." Her expression stiffened. "That's near the woods." I shrugged. "Yeah. It's quiet out there. Perfect for me." She hesitated, leaning in slightly. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If you hear whistling at night, don't go looking for it. Lock your doors. Stay inside. Do you understand?" I gave her an awkward laugh, but she didn't laugh back. "Right. Got it," I said, grabbing my bag and heading out. Small towns thrive on superstition, so I chalked it up to folklore. Every place has its ghost stories and urban legends. In the city, it was shadows in the subway tunnels or old elevators that rattled like skeletons. In Stony Hollow, it was apparently the whistler, a phantom figure who came in the dead of night, luring you into the woods with a sound so sharp it could make your ears bleed. Over the next few weeks, I heard snippets of the legend from various locals. Some swore they'd seen him, a tall shadow with hollow eyes and pale skin. Others claimed the whistling would follow them home if they didn't leave offerings of salt or coins near the trees. But when I pressed for more details, people got nervous. The conversation always ended with the same warning: don't go looking. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the story stuck with me. Late at night, when I lay in bed, I'd catch myself listening for it, the whistle. Sometimes I thought I heard faint, breathy notes on the wind, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Until it wasn't. It started 3 weeks after I moved in. At first, it was faint. A sharp, irregular whistling that came from deep in the woods behind my house. It wasn't melodic, more like short, piercing bursts, as though someone was struggling to play a flute with broken lungs. It always started after midnight and would continue for hours, stopping just before dawn. The first few nights, I told myself it was the wind. Or an animal. But soon, the sound grew closer, moving with the wind until it seemed to surround my house. I closed the curtains and told myself to ignore it. But ignoring it became harder when the whistling came from inside the house. It happened one night after I'd fallen asleep on the couch. I woke to hear it faintly, drifting down the hallway, teasing me. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and crept toward the noise. The whistle stopped as soon as I reached the end of the hall. The only sound was the deafening thud of my heartbeat. I checked every room, every closet, but the house was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after the noise was gone. The next day, I asked my neighbor, Hank, if he'd ever heard the whistler. He snorted, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "Hell yeah, I've heard it. Everyone has. Damn thing's been around longer than I have." "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Some kind of animal?" Hank's face darkened. You don't want to know. My advice? Keep your head down and your nose out of other folks' business. People who go digging around the Whistler don't usually stick around long. I wanted to press him further, but something in his tone stopped me. He sounded afraid. The whistling got worse. It followed me from room to room, a disembodied sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with shadows and sharp, breathy notes. Then the scratches started. One morning, I found long, deep gouges in the hardwood floor of my living room, as though something had been dragged across it during the night. Another day, I discovered muddy footprints leading from the back door to my bedroom. The door had been locked. The footprints ended at the foot of my bed. I called the sheriff, but he seemed unconcerned. Probably just some kids pulling a prank, he said. Or maybe you're letting your imagination get the better of you. But I wasn't imagining it. And I was determined to prove it. That's how I found myself in the woods behind my house late one night, armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. The whistling had started again, faint but persistent, and I was done being afraid. I followed the sound deep into the forest, the trees closing in around me like jagged teeth. The whistle grew louder as I moved closer. And then I found it. A clearing, lit dimly by the moon. In the center stood a weathered wooden trapdoor, half hidden beneath a pile of leaves. The whistling was coming from below. I opened the trapdoor and climbed down the narrow stairs. The smell hit me first, rotten sweat and something metallic. My flashlight beam danced across the room, illuminating rusted metal cages and chains hanging from the ceiling. The floor was littered with bones. Human bones. In the far corner, a man sat slumped against the wall. His skin was paper thin, stretched tight over his gaunt frame. His lips were cracked and bleeding, but he kept whistling. His hollow eyes met mine, and for a moment, his whistle faltered. "They make me do it," he rasped. "If I stop, they'll bury me like the others." I was about to ask who they were when the trapdoor slammed shut above me. Heavy footsteps echoed from the floor above. I never saw who it was, but I heard their voices, calm, familiar, the voices of people I'd smiled at in the grocery store or waved to on my morning walks. My flashlight flickered as I searched the room for another way out. The air was thick and choking, filled with the smell of decay. I stepped over piles of bones, my hands trembling as I ran them along the damp, earthen walls. Then I saw it, a small, rusted grate near the floor, just big enough for me to crawl through. I dropped to my knees and yanked at the grate. The metal was old and brittle, and with a few sharp pulls, it came loose. Behind it was a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. The tunnel was tight and suffocating, the dirt walls pressing against me on all sides. I crawled as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my hands raw from the rough dirt floor. The sound of voices echoed behind me, growing louder. They'd found the trapdoor. I pushed myself harder, my heart pounding in my ears. The tunnel opened into a ditch on the edge of the woods. I scrambled out, gasping for air, and looked around wildly. The forest was silent, the clearing behind me shrouded in shadow. I couldn't hear the whistling anymore. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard them, the voices. They were closer now, moving through the trees, calling out to each other. "She's close," one of them said. "She couldn't have gone far." Panic surged through me. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged and uneven. The flashlight in my hand was useless now, its beam barely flickering. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. Eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my lungs burned with every breath, but I didn't stop. I followed the road until I saw headlights in the distance. A truck was coming toward me, its engine rumbling in the quiet night. I waved my arms, screaming for help, and the truck skidded to a stop. The driver, a gruff man with a thick beard, jumped out, his eyes wide with concern. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, looking me up and down. "I need to get out of here," I gasped. "Please, just take me anywhere but here." He didn't ask any more questions. He helped me into the truck, and within minutes, we were speeding down the road, away from Stony Hollow. I didn't look back. I never returned to Stony Hollow. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, not even the police. Who would believe me? The town would deny everything, and I'd be the crazy outsider who stirred up trouble. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, that faint, breathy whistle. And I wonder if the man in the basement is still alive, whistling into the darkness to keep his captors at bay. Or if they've found someone new to take his place. One thing's for sure, the real horror of Stony Hollow wasn't the Whistler. It was the people who created him. They didn't need monsters. They were the monsters.